Welcome to Christian Virtual Fellowship. Christian Virtual Fellowship is a production of Allegiance to the King. Allegiance to the King is a church that meets online with participants from 5 of the 7 different continents of the world. So welcome. If you believe in the human Messiah, in the human Jesus Christ our Lord, and believe that there's only one God, and if you don't have a home church or a home Bible fellowship, join us. We'd love to have you join us. We offer not just teachings online, but we meet, we get together, we have fellowship during the week, we have prayer in the morning. So we have a lot to offer, and you don't have to feel isolated if you're a biblical Unitarian. Today's topic is going to be, and see here. Today's topic is about the book of Judges, and in particular, the first 2 chapters. We're going to read chapters 1 and 2 and discuss how it's relevant today. The first 2 chapters are introductory in nature. So let's start first with a little background, and much of it may be familiar to you. On the way to the Promised Land, the tribes of Israel were under the stern and strict leadership of Moses. Before he died, Moses had mentored Joshua, who led the nation after Moses died. Generally speaking, there was peace with God, who was present with the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. With Israelites trusting him, it was God's hope that the new nation would become a nation of priests, acting as a light to the world, leading people to God. God told Moses in Exodus, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you, Moses, shall speak to the sons of Israel." In verse 5, God reminds them of what was established at Mount Sinai with Moses, and that all of Israel had agreed to. A condition for Israel to satisfy being God's own possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That condition, generally speaking, was to obey his voice and keep his covenant, the one formed at Mount Sinai 40 years earlier. God went on to say, "Behold, I am going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Be attentive to him and obey his voice. Do not be rebellious toward him, for he will not pardon your rebellion, since my name is in him. But if you truly obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will completely destroy them." God sent his angel to guard them and to bring them to the place God had prepared. This angel was the Israelites' secret weapon. This was an invisible ally, better than any army or atomic bomb. The Israelites knew that there would be more fighting ahead. In fact, not only were there the Canaanites and all to fight, but there were spiritual forces, the gods of the Canaanites as well. And those spiritual forces wanted to defeat God's purposes. Note that early on, during Exodus, It was God's intention to completely destroy the inhabitants of the land. Joshua led his army with the Ark of the Covenant carried by the Levites. God cleared the way using hornets and earthquakes and other things to make the fight easier for the Israelites. But all of this was conditioned on the Israelites trusting and obeying him and keeping his covenant. Having a strong leader like Joshua united the tribes into a nation, and having the presence of God symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant gave the Israelites courage to attack many different groups of inhabitants. God promised to drive them out. I will drive them out from you little by little until you become fruitful and take possession of the land. And then in Deuteronomy, it says that the Lord your God will drive away these nations from you little by little. You will not be able to put an end to them quickly. Otherwise, the wild animals would become too numerous for you. While the promise of the land was certain, God let the Israelites know it wasn't going to happen overnight. In both these verses, it is God, not the Israelites, who will drive away these nations. In Joshua 24, it says that the Lord drove out from before us all the peoples, even the Amorites who lived in the land. We also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. Then Joshua said to the people, you will not be able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your wrongdoings or your sins. If you abandon the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and destroy you after he has done good to you. And the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. So Joshua said to the people, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen for yourselves the Lord, Yahweh, to serve him. And they said, we are witnesses. And then Joshua replies, now then, do away with the foreign gods which are in your midst, and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God and obey his voice. So there's this recommitment by the people to the covenant with God to serve him. But Joshua had to say, do away with the foreign gods that you have and listen to the God of Israel. So even after everything that they had already been through, they've gone through the Red Sea on dry ground. They 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 had they went across the Jordan River on dry ground, and they saw Jericho's walls fall. All that, they were still carrying around with them false idols and worshiping them. It goes on to say, now it came about after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died being 110 years old. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, on the north of Mount Gaash. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, and had known every deed of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Now they buried the bones of Joseph, which the sons of Israel brought up from Egypt, at Shechem, in the plot of land which Jacob had bought from the sons of Amor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. And they became the inheritance of Joseph's sons. And Eliezer, the son of Aaron, died, and they buried him at Gibeah, the town of his son Phinehas, which was given to him in the hill country of Ephraim. So this last portion of the book of Joshua brings to mind the book of Genesis by mentioning Joseph, and also the book of Exodus by mentioning Aaron, who was Moses' brother and assistant. And Joshua and all his generation who witnessed the mighty works of God in Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the Jordan River and what have you, that generation died and was buried. This brings us to the first two chapters of Judges. I would like you to keep in mind that the book is not strictly chronological, but has a message about faithfulness to God's covenant. Judges chapter 1. Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? The Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have handed the land over to him. Well, this seems to be a pretty good start. They go to the Lord. They ask for instructions, and the Lord replies. So this seems promising. Then Judah said to his brother, Simeon, now we have to realize that Judah is not a person. Judah is a tribe. And his brother, Simeon, is a tribe of thousands of other people. So these two tribes get together, and Judah says, go up with me into the territory allotted me, and let's fight the Canaanites, and I in turn will go with you into the territory allotted you. So Simeon went with him. So this is Judah's leader, who is Caleb, who is actually still alive at the time. One has to ask, does this bring glory to God by asking Simeon to reinforce Judah? Wasn't God enough? So we go to verse 4. Judah went up, and the Lord handed over to them the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek and fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. You probably know that the Canaanites and other nations in that area had worshipped the god of storms, lightning, and fertility, and his name was Baal. Adoni-Bezek, it strictly means my lord of lightning. And so one has to wonder why the writer of this chapter puts in this episode. We'll continue on here. But Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to gather up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. Then the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it, and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Afterward, the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites, living in the hill country, and in the Negev, and in the lowland. So Judah went up against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. The name of Hebron was previously Kiriath Arba, and they struck Shishai, Ahiman, and Talmah. And those are the three sons of Anak, we'll read about later. Then from there he went against the inhabitants of Debar. The name of Debar was previously Kiriath Sepher. And Caleb said, whoever attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will give him my daughter Aksah as a wife. Now Othniel, the son of Canash, Caleb's younger brother, captured it. So he gave him his daughter Aksah as a wife. Then it happened when she came to him, she incited him to ask her father for a field. Then later she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? She said to him, give me a blessing. Since you have given me the land of the Negev, give me springs of water also. So Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. You might recall that Caleb was one of the 12 spies sent out by Moses 40 years earlier. And he and Joshua had given a good report, while the other 10 spies gave a very discouraging report that contradicted God's command to invade the land. So Caleb was of the generation of Joshua. So we are reading events that happened while the Israelites were still listening to God and keeping the covenant. Now the descendants of Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, and some manuscripts say brother-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arad. And they went and lived with the people. Then Judah went with his brother Simeon, and they struck the Canaanites living in Sephath and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hormah. And Judah took Gaza with its territory, Askelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. Now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country. But they, the Judeans, could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Now Judah could not, I'm going to give a comment here. Judah could not drive out the valley inhabitants, but God could have. So what happened between taking the hill country and not taking the valley? Well, I don't know. Verse 20. Then they gave Hebron to Caleb as Moses had promised, and he drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak, and those were Shishai, Ahiman, and Talmai. Those were giants related to the Nephilim, something like Goliath, who was killed later by David. But the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites had lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Likewise, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph had men spy out Bethel. The name of the city previously was Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Please show us the entrance to the city, and we will treat you kindly." So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man and all of his family go free. Then the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and named it Luz, which is its name to this day. But Manasseh did not take possession of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in this land. And it came about, when Israel became strong, that they put the Canaanites to forced labor. But they did not drive them out completely. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer. So the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Ketron or the inhabitants of Nahalal. So the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. You might note the shift from the Lord driving out the Canaanites previously. See, previously we read how the Lord would be driving them out. And now it's the burden of the tribes. The tribes, not God, failed to capture all the lands promised to them. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Alab, or of Aksib, Helba, Athak, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, And the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Hanath became forced labor for them. Now, these aren't all of the tribes of Israel, because Reuben and Gad were on the east side of the Jordan River, which had already been taken. Issachar is not mentioned for some unknown reason, and Levi was not given a territory of land, for they get the tabernacle and the temple. Then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come to the valley. Yet the Amorites persisted in living on Mount Erez and Aijalon and Shalbim. But when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. So that's the end of chapter 1. Now, verses 21 through 36 of chapter 1 are about how the tribes failed to drive out the inhabitants of the land in certain places. And they were told by God that they would be driven out little by little. But recall, God did promise to drive them out. It wasn't the Israelites driving them out, it was God. So what happened? Why weren't they driven out? Chapter 2 tells us. But before we get to chapter 2, I'd like to share with you two maps. The map on the left represents the territory that was promised by God, that the Israelites, that this was their goal, is to have these certain territories. Now, that's on the left. On the right, there's another map of the same area, and you may notice that there are two shades to the map. There is a darker shade and a lighter shade. And the lighter shade represents the territories actually captured by Israel, by the Israelites. And there are some dotted ones along the coast and around the Dead Sea and up on the east side of the Jordan River by the Sea of Galilee. And so there are many places, but all of the cities that are identified in print there, they're all held by the inhabitants of the land, not by the Israelites. So that was the progress that they made. And the question is, well, what happened? Why? So Judges chapter 2. Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. Excuse me. But you have not obeyed me. What is this thing that you have done? Therefore, I also said, I will not drive them out from you, but they will become like thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. Now, when the angel of the Lord spoke these words, all the sons of Israel, the people, raised their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, which means the weepers, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. So before the invasion of Canaan, God had warned Israel not to make a covenant with the natives and not to marry them. In Exodus, it reads, and oh, by the way, before I go on to the next slide, I want to mention something, and that is that the word sacrificed in the last verse, verse 5, that's the only place you'll find the word sacrificed in the book. Exodus 34. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their asherim. For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous a jealous God. lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and you are invited, you eat of his sacrifice. And you take of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters whore after their gods, and make your sons whore after their gods. Israel already made a covenant with loving loyalty, hesed, at Mount Sinai. But 2 generations later, the Israelites didn't care. They did what they wanted to do. They made a covenant with the wicked people of the land. They came into agreement with the very people that should have been driven out because they worshipped false gods and would present a constant wicked influence. Well, how wicked? And here we have a depiction of a religious ceremony of the inhabitants of the land. And on the far right, there's a man without a shirt on, and he is putting firewood into the fire that is in the metal image of a god with its arms stretched out and its hands wide open. And in the foreground, you can see drummers banging on their drums. And then on the left and in the distance, you can see bugles blaring away, all to drown out the screams of the parents, the screams of the little baby being offered as a sacrifice to this false god. So the differences in religion between the Israelites and the inhabitants of the land was no small matter. It was really a matter of murderous, murderous hatred. And there's a common thread thought in our life, in our country, that there are many roads to heaven. Just be a good person and sincere. But worshiping the God of Abraham and worshiping Baal and Ashtoreth were as different as black and white. Yeah, really devout religious people bowing down there. So religious, so sincere, so demonic. In Exodus it read, "Behold, I am going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way, and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Be attentive to him and obey his voice. Do not be rebellious toward him, for he will not pardon your rebellion, since my name is in him. But if you truly obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversary. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of all these folks, and I will completely destroy them." We read this before. You see, behind what the Israelites could see was a spiritual war going on. And as long as the Israelites were faithful to the covenant and acted as God's people, the angel of the Lord could drive out the pagans and destroy them. But when the Israelites went into agreement with the pagans, there was nothing the angel of the Lord could do but obey God's orders. His hands were tied. The spiritual war against the children of Abraham continue to this day. And as stated in Paul's epistles, we are those children. Let's return to Judges chapter 2, verse 6. When Joshua had dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went, each one to his inheritance, to take possession of the land. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Then Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And so you might remember that we started this book with a verse, chapter 1, verse 1, saying, "Now it came about after the death of Joshua." So like I said earlier, this is not strictly chronological. We kind of hop back and forth a bit. And in fact, it is believed by some scholars that the first 2 chapters of Judges had been added to the other chapters of the book. And they get that from Joshua 24:31, which seems to almost verbatim say the same words that are in Judges 2:6. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, and had known every deed the Lord which he had done for Israel. So anyway, that's kind of interesting how the scripture may be edited or may be added to for whatever reason. But in any case, Judges is not a history book, although everything in it did happen. It's a book about how the conduct of the Israelites sabotaged their own success. Judges 2:9. And they buried him, Joshua, in the territory of his inheritance, in Tamath Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. All that the generation also was gathered to their fathers, and another generation rose up after them who did not know the Lord, nor even the work which he had done for Israel. Note that the generation did not know the Lord, this following generation. Apparently, the parents just did not drill into their thick heads that there was only one creator God who gave them the land. So why did the book start with, now it came about after the death of Joshua? Perhaps because without Joshua or someone else, there was no national leadership. The tribes were on their own. This is when the downward spiral started, and a pattern became established over the next 14 chapters, and it's set forth in a summary in chapter 2. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And the word Baals is kind of a generic term meaning false gods. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they followed other gods from the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them. So they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtaroth. And the Ashtaroth, the word means star, and it was their fertility goddess. Then the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he handed them over to plunderers, and they plundered them. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand against their enemies. Wherever they, excuse me, wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had spoken, and just as the Lord had sworn to them, so that they were severely distressed. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them from the hands of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they committed infidelity with other gods and bowed down to them. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do the same as their fathers. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who tormented and oppressed them. So it's interesting to know that even in the midst of all of the infidelity of the Israelites, that God still considered them his people. And he was moved with pity for them. I think that's really significant. But it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers, and following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their obstinate ways. And so the cycle of sin was a downward spiral for them. They would act more corruptly than their fathers. So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he said, because this nation has violated my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice, I in turn will no longer drive out from them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it as their fathers did or not. So the Lord allowed those nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, and he did not hand them over to Joshua. Now, taking a step back for a moment, I showed you the map where there is a large amount of the promised land still occupied by the pagans. And here they are living among the Israelites, the other nations in a manner of speaking. And I'm bringing back to my mind Genesis and the Garden of Eden and the temptation of the forbidden fruit of the tree that's right there in the middle of the garden. Well, in a sense, the other nations are acting like that tree of forbidden fruit. It was a way to see how faithful Israel was going to be towards God. Had Israel been obedient and faithful, the promises of prosperity, health, peace, and happiness would have emerged. The land where God's people lived would have become the center of the world. And we did have glimpses of that later when Solomon, for example, ruled and was the wisest man in the world. I go to Judges 2:22, and what the Lord said was that by them I may test Israel, whether they will care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. And then in Judges chapter 3, which we'll cover next time, it says that now these are the nations which the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all in Israel, who had no experience of any war in Canaan. In other words, this was the generation after the wars had started, and they basically made peace with the different nations that they were supposed to push out. And in return of making peace, the nations provided forced labor, as we read earlier. You know, in the past, God had provided Israel with two strong leaders, Moses and Joshua. Israel, made out of several tribes, needed human leadership to stay united and holy. They also needed to obey God and listen to him. They refused to do so. This blindness was not accidental because their enemy, the devil, did not want the nation of Israel to succeed and produce the Messiah. So now I'm going to make some conclusions here. And if you have any opinions after reading all this, I'd love to hear them. Sadly, the following generation after Joshua did not hold fast to the words of their covenant with God. The book of Judges tells some things about man's nature when he is without God. One, it is not only the devil or our own flesh that can get us into trouble. We will read in the following chapters how the environment the Israelites were in, surrounded by wicked and seducing people, can lead them into the practice of sin and abandonment of God. Number two, repeated cycles of disobedience, discipline, and deliverance do not change people's hearts. In fact, they become worse over time. Three, the practice of sin is a downward spiral to inhumanity and ungodliness. For that if we don't have an intentional plan for our lives, our family and society, the rest of the troubled world will provide a plan for us that will only bring sorrow, death, sin, and death. Now, I may ask you, do you see any trends in our society today that parallel what Judges taught? Do we recall the men who fought the Nazis and fascism and built modern America? Does the younger generation recall what the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. stood for and stood against? Do we even remember why the Pilgrims, the Quakers, and even the Catholics came to the 13 colonies? Do we even know what the terms of the New Covenant are? I want to leave this study on a positive note. So I'm turning to Hebrews chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 8. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, to the extent that he is also the mediator of a better covenant, Jesus Christ, which has been enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been free of fault, no circumstances would have been sought for a second. For in finding fault with the people, he says, Behold, days are coming, says the Lord, when I will bring about a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers on the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and I did not care about them, says the Lord. For this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one of his fellow citizen and each one of his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they will all know me, from the least to the greatest of them. For I will be merciful to their wrongdoings, and their sins I will no longer remember. When he said a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. But whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is about to disappear. And we might note that the covenant is not the law of God, which Paul in Romans says is good, righteous, and holy. So to end my teaching, I did something just terrible. I went to ChatGPT to ask what he thought about the first two chapters of Judges, and this is what it came up with. This passage speaks of a new covenant. Is speaking of what we just read in Hebrews, excuse me. This passage speaks of a new covenant that God will establish with his people, characterized by internal transformation rather than external obedience to laws. It promises forgiveness of sins and an intimate personal relationship with God. In the New Testament, particularly in the book of Hebrews, the new covenant is further expounded upon, highlighting Jesus Christ as the mediator of this covenant through his sacrificial death and resurrection. The terms of the new covenant include salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, the forgiveness of sins, and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit to empower believers to live according to God's will. Overall, the new covenant is about a personal relationship with God, forgiveness of sins, and empowerment to live a transformed life through Jesus Christ. And so that ends my message for tonight. And I will stop sharing. And anyway, I hope that that was a blessing to you. We have any comments, criticisms?
Hey Ray, I don't know if it's just my brain. Um, you said when we were reading, we were finding that the Israelites were not doing things God's way, and they would try to drive out they didn't, or they chose not to drive out their enemies and put them into forced labor. Do I have that correct? Or
Yeah, yeah. What
okay,
what what was striking to me is that God promised, "I'm going to drive them out. I'm going to drive them out. I'm going to drive them out." And then Joshua said, "Hey, you have to give up those false idols. Those wooden and metal and ceramic idols that you pray to. You got to trash those things, and then the Lord's going to be with us." And so at first, God in his forbearance kind of went along like the Lord was with Judah, for example. And they started kicking some butt there. They started advancing more and more. But it came to like all of a sudden it's like Benjamin can't drive them out. So and so can't drive them out. Asher can't drive them out. And the question that I had by the end of the chapter is, well, why is that? And it's really because there's a couple of things. One is they didn't give up their false idols. They didn't tear down the altars like God told them to. And they were entering into agreements about forced labor, which indicates to me that they had some sort of agreement with the nations that they were trying to drive out. And and so there is this toleration going on, and then the intermingling, the sons marrying their daughters, the daughters marrying their sons, and before you know it, you got the tribes worshiping the wrong gods.
yeah, yeah,
So we have I showed those two maps and hey, what was going to happen, what should have happened, and then what did happen.
yep,
And even within the light shaded areas that were supposedly captured, there were lots of cities that were still occupied by the Canaanites and all those folks. Dan,
Unmute. Thanks, Ray. I appreciate it. I really did appreciate it. I was thinking at the end you were mentioning there, and I was thinking maybe there's an attractiveness to slavery, for the owner versus the slave. In other words, it's kind of like, wow, why should we get rid of these people? If we can force them to do all the hard work for us and blah blah blah. That's not what God said to do, as we know. And that thought just hit my mind. It's kind of like it was thinking as you were teaching in Corinthians, bad company corrupts good character.
yeah,
And here, certainly, that's what they surrounded themselves with. God knew the lesson. He needed them to purge and clean the land out 100%, so there'd be no false goods. Um, and yet they didn't. And maybe, like I said, maybe it was just the attractiveness of slavery, that they could do the hard work for them, and other things too. I'm sure they were under a great spiritual attack. um, but the other thing that I was reminded of is the um, the unclean always pollutes the clean. In other words, if you have a barrel of apples and 99 are whole and one is rotten, the rotten always infects the 99. The 99 will never take that rotten apple and make it a good apple. And I was just thinking, it's just, I think there's a spiritual principle there. And then all the times, if you step on a grave, you become unclean. It's not like I'm clean, so I stepped on the grave and I made it clean,
yeah.
and blah blah. So anyway, thanks, Ray. It's a great reminder. And like I said, I've been immersed in the book of Revelation, and out of Babylon we must come.
And I appreciate your comment, Dan, and I would add to it that it's amazing how God touches us and we become clean.
Yeah,
And
that's the only way to be
and
clean.
yeah, but but
Yeah,
but that's completely what nature does not tell us. The nature
right.
tells us that one bad apple ruins a barrel.
And
Yeah,
nothing can corrupt God, but God can, it takes God to purify.
exactly. Suzanne.
Yeah, that just made me think of a lot of different passages in the Bible, like Isaiah having the coal touch his lips, but also
Exactly.
Zechariah, the priest in Zechariah, I think his name's Joshua. He's so unclean before God, and God just changes his clothes into these clean robes and does the same thing, touching him and making him clean. Like it's like the opposite of contamination, kind of like what Tan was talking about last week. God touches us and confers righteousness upon us.
Yeah.
So we get Jesus's righteousness on us because we become the righteousness of God, and our dirty robes, and like in Revelation, we're wearing white robes and all that stuff. And it's says over and over in scripture, this is not anything that we do on our own. It's by God's grace. And that's what I kept thinking of when you were talking, Ray, about how compassionate is God, that he sees them sacrificing their children to the fire, which in Jeremiah he says was detestable, and that was called the Valley of Slaughter, in the Valley of Topheth, and that was also where the people would sacrifice to these gods and sacrifice their children. And he said, they did this detestable thing, something that would never come up into my heart. And, that's just, it's just amazing to think. Then you read these verses where it says that even though they were so wicked and detestable, God still had compassion on them and still called them back to him and still honored this covenant that he made with Abraham. I think it's just, I don't know, if we ponder that, it's just beyond me. I just listened to a podcast today, Mullins podcast, Ryan Mullins, that Sean Finnegan said he liked, which is not a Unitarian podcast, but being a philosopher, he did this podcast on the whole philosophy of like, why did God create? Because there's classical views and unclassical views about God's impassibility. Obviously God didn't create all these things and us because he needed to, because Acts 17 says he doesn't need anything from us. But when you really get a grip on this whole idea that God existed like for outside of time forever, like just pondering what and who God is, that at some point he decided to create, and he didn't do it out of need. We say he did it out of love, but he didn't like have anybody to love forever. I mean, it's like we can't even conceive of or understand like, why did God create us? But when we see what he did, this planet he created, and how the detail that he put into all his creation, and the amazing thing that he did to create all this life that would reproduce itself. He didn't just like make a lot of little clay things and stick it in a little diorama like we would do. I mean, he actually created humans to make baby humans, and dogs to make baby dogs, and trees to make baby trees. I mean, it's like it just, I don't know. Maybe I'm just waxing poetic or something here, but I just feel like we lose our awe because we just take for granted that, oh yeah, God's there, and he, and we think about like, oh God, I better not do this because God will get mad. It's like we should be going way beyond that. We should be really meditating on the awesome reality that we exist, and that we exist because God chose to take the time. Well, to us, it's time. I don't know what it was to him, but chose to create, and not just create stuff or create the way that the ancient Near East gods were creating out of jealousy and selfishness and wanting humans to be their slaves. But God created to have us in relationship with him and to love him out of a free will and a choice. I don't know. I just feel like we should be spending more time thinking about those things, because it's just, yeah. And listen to that podcast episode. I thought it was so interesting. Like all the philosophies behind like, why did God create? We don't know, but we know what he has created. And it just, it, like it says in Romans, that everything in creation points to his glory and to his intelligence and everything else about him. But anyway, just that's been on my mind and heart for the last few days. I just thought I would go there.
Well, I think that's pretty profound because, and I don't have any answer for that, but I know that we are not in the last chapter of his book, in the sense that there is so much more to come. And what our own destiny is with God and how all that works is going to be utterly mind-blowing, I'm sure, and wonderful, because we have such a great God, and his signature in the stars and on the earth and the flowers and everything. Such a beautiful creativity that we have here by his hand, and the amount of detail just is incredible.
Yeah, I
It's
put
really
that
well.
link to that episode in the chat. I just feel like everyone should listen to it just because it just kind of like, it just takes you over there. Like we never stop and think like, why did God bother to create it all? Like he didn't have to, if he didn't, there was a time when he hadn't created yet. What is that like?
Yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, I think on that, I think I'll stop the recording, and I would like to again invite those on YouTube who have gone through the teaching this evening, that to invite you to join us at a2kchurch.org. And we're also on Facebook, and we would love to have your fellowship and to enjoy your company. And anyway, God bless and good night.